To the Galactic Union, black holes are sacred, terrifying tears in the fabric of reality. The closest thing most of their oldest civilizations have to a god they can actually point a telescope at. To the New York City Department of Sanitation, one particular black hole turned out to be, after a great deal of tedious cost-benefit analysis, simply the most efficient way to handle the 4 o'clock pickups. Humanity didn't set out to break the fundamental laws of physics. We just filed them quietly under miscellaneous waste and moved on to the next item on a very long municipal to-do list. This is that story. By the time humanity had been a member of the Galactic Union for 6 years, Earth's waste crisis had become the kind of problem every government on the planet had learned to talk about with great seriousness and solve with absolutely nothing. Generation after generation, the way a person might keep meaning to clean out a garage they haven't opened in a decade. It wasn't that humanity lacked the technology. Advanced matter recycling, offered generously, if a little condescendingly, by several Galactic Union member species in the years following first contact, had already cut Earth's landfill growth by nearly 60%. It wasn't that humanity lacked the will either. 3 separate global summits had produced ambitious, well-funded plans to finish the job within a decade. It was, in the end, the same problem that had plagued human civilization since long before anyone had ever looked up and wondered what might be living among the stars. The last 20% of any hard problem is always, without exception, the hardest and least glamorous part, and nobody, not one government, not one agency, not one department, particularly wanted to be the one holding the shovel when the actual unglamorous work of dealing with an entire planet's remaining industrial and hazardous waste finally had to get done. It fell in the end, not to some grand international body, nor to any gleaming galactic research consortium, but to a mid-level logistics coordinator at the New York City Department of Sanitation named Denise Okafor-Reyes, who had spent the better part of 11 years quietly optimizing garbage truck routes through the 5 boroughs and had, somewhere around her 9th year on the job, developed the particular battle-tested pragmatism of someone who has stopped being impressed by anything, including, as it would turn out, the fundamental structure of space-time itself. Denise's proposal, when she first floated it at a fairly unremarkable interdepartmental budget meeting, was not received as the historic moment it would eventually become. It was received initially with the same mild, distracted skepticism that greeted most of Denise's proposals, right up until someone actually read past the executive summary. Denise herself had come to the Department of Sanitation almost by accident. She'd studied industrial engineering in college with vague ambitions of working in aerospace logistics, the kind of career that sounded impressive at dinner parties and involved, in her imagination at the time, gleaming control rooms and rockets rather than the considerably less romantic reality of coordinating recycling truck routes through Queens. A summer internship with the city's sanitation department, taken mostly because it paid better than the unpaid aerospace internships she'd applied for and been rejected from, had turned into a permanent position, and the permanent position had turned over 11 quiet, unglamorous years into a genuine, if entirely unexpected, expertise. Denise Okafor-Reyes understood the flow of waste through a major metropolitan area, where it came from, where it needed to go, what it cost to move it, and what happened when any single link in that enormous invisible chain broke down, better than almost anyone else in the 5 boroughs, and possibly, though she would never have claimed this herself, better than almost anyone else on the planet. It was, she liked to say, the least glamorous form of expertise imaginable, and also one of the most quietly essential. Nobody thanked the sanitation department when the trash disappeared on schedule, every single week, without fail. Everybody complained, loudly and at length, on the rare occasions it didn't. It had taught her, over more than a decade, a particular kind of humility that she suspected most aerospace engineers never had to develop. The deep, practical understanding that the unglamorous, invisible work of keeping a civilization running was, in its own quiet way, just as essential as anything more celebrated, and that solving a genuinely hard logistics problem was its own reward, whether or not anyone outside her department ever noticed. So when Earth's continued membership in the Galactic Union brought with it, among a great many other transformative changes, access to trans-dimensional freight technology previously reserved for interstellar cargo and colony resupply runs. Denise had done what she always did when a new tool crossed her desk. She'd spent an evening reading through the technical specifications, purely out of professional curiosity, and asked herself the same question she asked about every piece of infrastructure she encountered. What's this actually good for, that nobody's thought to use it for yet? You want, her supervisor said slowly, staring at the report in front of him, to route hazardous and non-recyclable municipal waste through a trans-dimensional hauling corridor to the Great Annihilator. I want to route it to Sagittarius A*, technically, Denise said. The Great Annihilator is a separate, smaller object about 100 light-years off, and honestly, it's got better trajectory logistics for our purposes. So functionally, yes, the Annihilator's the one we'd actually be using. But essentially, yes, that's the proposal. The black hole at the center of the galaxy. One of a couple dozen viable candidates technically, but yes, broadly, the black hole at the center of the galaxy. Her supervisor set the report down very carefully, the way a person sets down something they suspect might be about to explode. Denise, he said, that is... He stopped, visibly searching for the right word, and settled, eventually, on the only one that seemed to fit. That's a very big thing to just put in a routing proposal. With respect, Denise said, I've been putting very big things in routing proposals for 11 years. The scale's different. The math isn't. You've got a source location, you've got a destination with theoretically infinite absorption capacity, and you've got a transportation method. The conquered licensed trans-dimensional freight lanes we've had access to for 3 years now, that we've mostly just been using to ship industrial equipment to the Ganymede colonies, that can, with some modification, handle the route. I ran the numbers. It's cheaper than our current landfill expansion plan by a factor of about 40. It's cheaper than the incineration program by a factor of about 60. And it solves the problem permanently because, and I want to stress this part, nothing that goes into an active supermassive black hole is ever, under any circumstances, coming back out. There was a long silence around the conference table. Run it by legal, her supervisor said finally in the tone of a man who has decided, against every professional instinct he possesses, to let this particular very big thing become someone else's problem for a while. And for the love of God, run it by whoever handles our Galactic Union compliance filings. I have a feeling this is going to need a permit from somebody. It took, in the end, considerably less time than anyone at the Department of Sanitation expected for the permit to clear. This was not, as several Galactic Union officials would later insist in increasingly exasperated diplomatic communique, because anyone had actually understood what they were approving. It was because the Union's permitting bureaucracy, vast, ancient, and staffed by beings who had, over many thousands of years, developed an institutional habit of treating black holes as a matter for theologians and astrophysicists rather than municipal engineers, had never once, in the entire recorded history of the Union's Waste Management Compliance Office, received an application specifically requesting to dispose of miscellaneous, non-recyclable municipal solid waste via supermassive gravitational disposal and the automated review system, built to flag applications against a comprehensive but entirely conventional list of known hazardous disposal methods, simply had no category that matched, and no rule explicitly prohibiting it. It flagged the request, generated a standard low-priority routing classification code, and approved it in 11 minutes, exactly as it would have approved a permit to build a new recycling depot. Nobody at the Galactic Union's central offices noticed the approval at all until nearly 4 months later, by which point the New York City Department of Sanitation had already completed its first full trial run, a modest, carefully monitored trans-dimensional shipment of roughly 200 tons of non-recyclable industrial waste, routed through a licensed freight corridor, and released with the same procedural indifference the department applied to every other scheduled disposal run, directly into the event horizon of the Great Annihilator. It worked exactly as Denise's models had predicted. The waste vanished permanently, cleanly, with none of the environmental risk of incineration and none of the long-term land use cost of a landfill. The trial run's total cost came in 11% under budget. Denise submitted her follow-up report, a dry, thorough, entirely unremarkable document titled Phase 1 Trans-Dimensional Disposal Trial, Results and Recommendations for Full-Scale Implementation, and moved directly on to scheduling the second run because that was quite simply the job. It was only when a routine astrophysical monitoring station operated by a galactic Union member species called the Threll, an old, deeply contemplative civilization who had spent the better part of 11,000 years quietly studying the Great Annihilator as one of their most sacred sites, a place their oldest religious text described as the mouth that consumes all endings, a locus of cosmic significance approached only with elaborate ceremony and centuries of careful theological preparation, detected an unauthorized mass influx entering the event horizon on a trajectory and schedule, with absolutely no ceremonial signature whatsoever, that anyone outside the New York City Department of Sanitation realized what had actually happened. The Threll themselves were, by the standards of most Galactic Union member species, a relatively small and quiet civilization, numbering perhaps 11 billion across a modest cluster of core worlds. But their cultural and philosophical influence within the Union vastly outstripped their population. They had, over their long history, developed one of the galaxy's most sophisticated traditions of contemplative astrophysics, an entire branch of scholarship, blending rigorous observational science with deep philosophical and religious reflection, built almost entirely around the patient, reverent study of the universe's most extreme phenomena. Black holes, in Threll cosmology, were not simply gravitational anomalies to be measured and catalogued. They were understood as the ultimate expression of a fundamental principle at the heart of Threll religious thought, that all things, given enough time, return to a state of perfect, undifferentiated unity, and that the study of that process, slow, patient, endlessly humbling, was among the highest callings a Threll scholar-priest could pursue. The Great Annihilator held a particularly exalted place within that tradition. Unlike Sagittarius A star, the far larger supermassive black hole at the galaxy's exact center, the Annihilator was closer, more directly observable from Threll space, and had, over 11 millennia of careful study, become the focal point of an entire branch of Threll religious practice, the site of great pilgrimage observatories, generational research stations, and a calendar of sacred observances tied to its slow, majestic orbital rhythms. To the Threll, watching a routine sensor log casually flag an unscheduled mass influx entering that same sacred site, timed not to any cosmic rhythm at all, but to the mundane collection needs of a handful of human cities on the other side of the galaxy, was not merely disorienting. It was, in the words of the monitoring station's first horrified report, a violation so casual, so entirely without malice or awareness, that it somehow felt more profound than any deliberate act of desecration could have. The Threll monitoring station's report, when it finally reached the Galactic Union's Central Council, used the phrase unprecedented desecration no fewer than 11 times. By the time the Galactic Union's Emergency Committee on Cosmological Affairs convened its first session on the matter, the New York City Department of Sanitation had already completed 6 additional trial runs, expanded the program to include 4 other major metropolitan waste authorities across 3 continents, and, in the single detail that would go on to cause the most profound and lasting distress among the Union's more traditionally minded member species, synchronized the entire disposal schedule with the Great Annihilator's own orbital mechanics, timing each shipment to coincide with the black hole's natural rotational cycle for maximum trajectory efficiency in a manner that human logistics planners referred to, with the same casual precision they applied to every other recurring municipal service, as trash day. They have, said Ambassador Threlka Voss, senior representative of the Threll delegation, addressing the emergency session with a voice that trembled with something between grief and disbelief, assigned a collection schedule to the mouth that consumes all endings. They have given our most sacred cosmological site a pickup time. The chamber filled with representatives from dozens of member species, some ancient, some newly admitted, all of whom had, in one form or another, grown up under civilizations that regarded supermassive black holes with a mixture of scientific curiosity and deep instinctive religious awe, sat in stunned, uncomfortable silence. It was into this silence that the Union's committee chair, a weary, centuries-old diplomat of the long-lived Corvain species, finally spoke. "I have reviewed the human government's official response to our formal inquiry," the chair said, holding up a datapad with the particular resigned expression of someone who has read something several times hoping it might say something different on a later attempt. "I will read it to you directly, because I do not believe I can adequately paraphrase it. It states, and I quote, "The disposal program in question is a standard municipal waste management initiative conducted under valid Galactic Union Permit number 88214C, approved through your own office's automated compliance system. All disposal activities comply fully with applicable safety regulations. The New York City Department of Sanitation regrets any cultural distress caused by this program and welcomes further dialogue, but respectfully notes that the current disposal schedule offers significant cost savings to municipal taxpayers and has already reduced regional landfill expansion by an estimated 40%. A formal cultural liaison meeting can be scheduled through the department's public engagement office during standard business hours." There was another long silence. "Standard business hours," Ambassador Voss repeated faintly. "Quick pause here because I promise the diplomatic meeting that's coming up is worth waiting for. If an entire alien civilization has a full religious crisis over a garbage truck schedule is exactly your kind of story. This channel's got a whole back catalog of humanity accidentally causing cosmic-scale chaos through sheer bureaucratic competence. Hit subscribe, drop a like, and tell us in the comments which sacred cosmic landmark you think we should turn into a parking garage next. All right, back to the emergency session. Not every member species of the Galactic Union reacted to the revelation with the same horrified reverence as the Threll. The Union was, after all, an alliance of dozens of wildly different civilizations, each with its own relationship to the deep cosmic phenomena scattered across the galaxy, and the initial emergency session had barely adjourned before those differences began to surface, loudly and at length, across an increasingly chaotic series of follow-up hearings. The Threll delegation, and several culturally similar species whose oldest religious and philosophical traditions treated supermassive black holes with the kind of reverent, careful distance most human cultures once reserved for volcanoes or the ocean depths, argued forcefully for immediate sanction, a formal Union condemnation, a suspension of humanity's waste disposal permit, and, in Ambassador Voss's considerably more heated private remarks to fellow delegates, an apology commensurate with the scale of what has been defiled. But a second, quieter faction within the Union, largely composed of species whose civilizations had, for one reason or another, developed a more purely scientific relationship with cosmic phenomena, unburdened by millennia of theological weight, found themselves, somewhat to their own surprise, considerably less troubled by the whole affair, and in a few notable cases, openly impressed. "I have spent 40 years of my professional career," said Dr. Keithus Wren, a delegate representing the technologically advanced but comparatively young Illith Confederation, during one particularly heated committee session, attempting to model the practical industrial applications of active supermassive black holes, purely as an academic exercise, because the engineering challenges involved in safely directing matter into an event horizon at scale are considered, across this entire Union, to be a problem so difficult it borders on theoretical. The humans did not solve this problem through some breakthrough in exotic physics. They solved it because a woman working in municipal waste management needed a cheaper way to dispose of trash, ran the numbers on a Tuesday afternoon, and discovered that the existing technology already available to her happened to work. I understand the religious significance this holds for our Threll colleagues, and I do not dismiss it. But I would ask this committee to also recognize that humanity has, entirely by accident, achieved something several of our most advanced engineering institutes have failed to accomplish through decades of deliberate, well-funded research. That is precisely the problem, Ambassador Voss said sharply. They did not achieve it. They stumbled into it with no reverence, no ceremony, no apparent understanding whatsoever of the significance of what they were doing, and then they scheduled a pickup time for it. A species capable of treating something this profound with such total, casual indifference is not a species I am comfortable trusting with continued access to it. Dr. Wren considered this for a long moment. "With respect, Ambassador," she said, I would gently suggest that casual indifference to profound cosmic significance is, in fact, precisely why this worked. Every prior attempt at directed matter disposal into an active event horizon, across every species that has tried it, has been slowed and complicated by exactly the kind of careful, reverent, ceremonial caution your culture rightly values. Because that caution, however meaningful, makes the engineering considerably harder to execute at any practical scale. Humanity's engineers did not need to overcome centuries of theological weight before running the numbers. They simply ran the numbers. I am not certain that is a flaw in their character. I suspect, uncomfortable as it may be to consider, that it might actually be the single reason this was possible at all. A third delegate, representing the notoriously blunt and mercantile Crevis Compact, chose that moment to interject with the particular unbothered directness his species was known for across the entire Union. "I would simply like to note," said Trade Delegate Orrin Vask, not looking up from the small data terminal he'd been quietly consulting throughout the entire session, that whatever the theological implications, the humans have also apparently developed the most cost-effective large-scale matter disposal method in this Union's recorded history, and at least 4 member species shipping consortiums have already contacted my office this week inquiring about licensing the logistics framework for their own industrial waste. I recognize this is not the primary concern of this committee, but I would be remiss not to mention that whatever else this incident represents, it also represents, from a purely commercial standpoint, an extremely lucrative opportunity, and I suspect several member governments currently expressing outrage in this chamber will be quietly filing licensing requests within the month. Ambassador Voss turned a slow, incredulous look on the trade delegate. "You are discussing commercial licensing," she said, during a committee session convened specifically to address a matter of profound religious desecration. "I'm discussing commercial licensing," Delegate Vask agreed placidly, "because in my experience, Ambassador, religious and cultural objections have an unusually strong tendency to soften considerably once a viable, cost-effective compromise is placed on the table. I do not say this to diminish your concerns, which I take seriously. I say it because I suspect the fastest path to a resolution here is not further outrage, but a genuine conversation about what accommodation might actually look like. The kind of conversation, notably, that this committee has not yet actually attempted with the humans themselves. It was, though nobody in the chamber particularly wanted to admit it in the moment, a fair point, and it was this observation, more than any of the hours of impassioned theological argument that preceded it, that finally prompted the committee to formally request the cultural liaison meeting that would, in time, actually resolve the crisis. Denise Okafor Reyes had not, in 11 years of optimizing garbage truck routes through the 5 boroughs, ever expected to find herself seated across a conference table from an actual alien ambassador, but the Department of Sanitation's Public Engagement Office had, true to the letter of its own official response, scheduled the requested cultural liaison meeting during standard business hours, and Denise, as the program's lead logistics coordinator and the person who understood the actual mechanics of the operation better than anyone else in the building, had been asked, with very little advance warning, to attend. She'd spent the 2 days beforehand reading everything she could find about Threll cosmology and religious practice, a crash course conducted mostly at her kitchen table late at night, surrounded by hastily printed summary documents from the State Department's newly expanded Office of Interspecies Cultural Affairs. Feeling more out of her depth than she had at any point since her very first week on the job 11 years earlier. She'd learned about the mouth that consumes all endings, about 11,000 years of pilgrimage observatories and generational research stations, about a religious and philosophical tradition so old and so deeply woven into an entire civilization's understanding of itself that Denise found herself, somewhere around midnight on the second night, genuinely unsure whether anything she could possibly say in that meeting would be remotely adequate to the scale of what she'd apparently disrupted. Ambassador Voss arrived with a full delegation. 3 additional Threll representatives, a translator, and a visible, barely contained tension that Denise, who had spent over a decade defusing furious constituents at community board meetings over missed pickups and overflowing dumpsters, recognized immediately as the alien diplomatic equivalent of someone who had shown up ready for a fight. "Ambassador," Denise said, once introductions had concluded and everyone had settled, somewhat awkwardly, around a conference table designed for a considerably smaller and more uniform range of body types than the meeting currently required. I want to start by saying I understand this is a serious concern for your people, and I'm not here to dismiss that. I spent the last 2 nights reading everything I could find about your culture's relationship to the Annihilator, and I'll be honest with you, I don't think I fully understand it, not the way someone who grew up inside that tradition would. But I understand enough to know this isn't a small thing to your people, and I owe you an honest conversation, not a form letter from our public engagement office. Something in Ambassador Voss's rigid posture shifted almost imperceptibly at that. That is, she said after a pause, considerably more than I expected from this meeting, Coordinator. Our prior correspondence with your government's official channels led me to expect little more than procedural deflection. For what it's worth, Denise said, I think a lot of that deflection wasn't malice, Ambassador. I think it was just a government bureaucracy running on autopilot, answering a complicated cultural question with the same template it uses for every other permit dispute. That's not an excuse, it's just, I think it's actually part of the same problem you're upset about. Nobody stopped to think this through carefully, at any stage, until it was already a crisis. You do not deny the significance of what you have done. I don't fully understand the significance of what we've done, Denise said honestly. I understand black holes are important to your culture. I understand this one specifically has religious meaning for your people that goes back, what, 11,000 years? I'm not going to pretend I grasp the full weight of that because I don't. What I do understand is logistics and cost, and whether a program is actually serving the people it's meant to serve. So help me understand what you actually need here, because stop entirely isn't something I can promise you without a city council vote, 4 public hearings, and probably a lawsuit. But there might be a version of this that works for both of us. It was, Denise would later admit, not remotely the diplomatic approach anyone had trained her for. She'd received a single afternoon briefing on basic interspecies etiquette before the meeting, most of which she'd already forgotten. But it was, as it turned out, exactly the kind of blunt, practical honesty that cut through several hours of circling diplomatic tension faster than a week of formal negotiation might have. The schedule, Ambassador Voss said finally after a long consultation with her delegation conducted in rapid, untranslated Threll. The trash day, that is perhaps the detail my people find most difficult to accept, not the disposal itself. I confess, having heard Dr. Wren's arguments at length over the past several weeks, that I am no longer entirely certain the act itself constitutes desecration in any meaningful sense. But the schedule, the routine, the complete absence of any recognition, any ceremony, any acknowledgement whatsoever that what you are approaching is not simply another municipal resource to be optimized on a Tuesday afternoon. Denise thought about this for a moment. What if, she said slowly, we kept the schedule? Because honestly, Ambassador, the schedule's the whole reason this program works. It's not something I can just throw out. But we added something to it. Some kind of acknowledgement. I don't know what that would look like from your side, but if your people wanted to be present for scheduled disposal runs, observe them, even conduct whatever ceremony you felt was appropriate, alongside our operations, we could absolutely coordinate that. We're not trying to hide what we're doing. We just genuinely didn't understand, going in, that anyone would want to be there for it. Ambassador Voss looked, for the first time since the meeting began, faintly surprised. You would permit that? Threll observers, present for your disposal runs, conducting our own rites alongside your operations? Ambassador? Denise said, with the particular weary practicality of someone who has spent over a decade finding compromises between people who each believe, with total sincerity, that their concern is the most important thing in the world. I coordinate garbage pickup for 8.5 million people. I have made accommodations for religious observance schedules, cultural dietary waste sorting requirements, and one memorable incident involving a community garden that insisted its compost be collected only during a specific lunar phase. Adding a standing invitation for Threll religious observers to a recurring disposal schedule is, genuinely, one of the easier accommodation requests I've fielded this year. One of the junior Threll delegates, a young clergy member named Kalu Thren, who had said almost nothing throughout the entire tense meeting, spoke up for the first time. her translated voice carrying a note of genuine curiosity that cut through the room's lingering formality. "May I ask," she said, "what determines your disposal schedule in the first place? I confess I assumed, before this meeting, that the timing was arbitrary. A matter of pure administrative convenience, chosen without any regard for the annihilator itself." "It's not arbitrary," Denise said, grateful for a question she could actually answer with confidence. "We time each run to the annihilator's rotational cycle, actually. Same reason a satellite launch gets timed to orbital windows. It's not reverence exactly, I won't pretend it started that way. It's physics. But the schedule you're all so upset about is, in its own strange way, already built around paying close attention to that object's natural rhythms. We just never thought to tell anyone that's what we were doing because to us it was just an engineering detail, not something worth mentioning." Kailu Thren turned to Ambassador Voss and said something quiet in untranslated Threll. The ambassador considered it for a long moment, her expression shifting almost imperceptibly. "My colleague observes," Ambassador Voss said finally, translating for the room, "that a schedule built around careful attention to the annihilator's natural cycles is not, perhaps, so far removed from our own sacred calendar as I initially assumed. The difference, it seems, lies not in whether attention is paid, but in whether that attention is named and honored as attention at all." It was, Denise would reflect much later, the exact moment the meeting had actually turned. Not through any grand diplomatic gesture, but through one young clergy member's simple, curious question, and the quiet realization, shared slowly around that crowded conference table, that two civilizations who seemed at first to have nothing at all in common had, without either side quite realizing it, already been paying the same kind of careful attention to the same distant, terrifying, magnificent object, in two entirely different languages, for longer than either had understood. It took another 3 weeks of negotiation, several additional committee hearings, and, in a detail that Denise found privately, quietly hilarious, though she was careful never to say so in front of Ambassador Voss, an entire subcommittee formed specifically to determine the appropriate protocol for combining an 11,000-year-old religious rite with a municipal waste disposal schedule before the first joint disposal run finally took place. The subcommittee's deliberations were, by all accounts, extraordinary in their own right. A genuinely surreal blend of ancient theological protocol and modern logistics planning, conducted across a series of increasingly good-natured working sessions that brought together Threll clergy, human sanitation engineers, and a rotating cast of Galactic Union cultural liaisons, all trying, with varying degrees of success, to translate concepts across traditions that had never once, in either civilization's history, needed to intersect. The Threll clergy needed to understand freight release windows and trajectory calculation margins. The human engineers needed to understand ceremonial timing requirements tied to subtle variations in the annihilator's observed luminosity that no human sensor had ever been calibrated to detect with the precision Threll tradition demanded. More than once, the sessions produced genuine breakthroughs on both sides. A Threll astrophysicist priest named Kailu Thren, junior to Ambassador Voss but considerably more curious about the practical engineering involved, spent an entire afternoon with Denise's technical team, learning the mechanics of trans-dimensional freight release, and left, by her own later admission, with a newfound appreciation for what she called the quiet, unglamorous discipline of logistics as its own form of devotion, a patience I recognize, even if I did not expect to find it in a shipping schedule. It was, by any reasonable measure, one of the stranger diplomatic events in the young history of humanity's membership in the Galactic Union. A modest fleet of Threll ceremonial vessels, ancient and elegant, arrived in formation alongside a considerably less elegant human freight convoy carrying, on this particular run, roughly 340 tons of non-recyclable industrial waste from a coalition of participating cities. Ambassador Voss and a full delegation of Threll clergy conducted a solemn, hours-long rite, chanted verses in a language older than most human civilizations, elaborate ritual gestures performed in perfect synchronization, a genuine and moving display of reverence for what their tradition called the mouth that consumes all endings, while alongside them, a small crew of human logistics technicians ran final systems checks, confirmed trajectory calculations, and, at the precisely scheduled moment, released the shipment into the event horizon with the same calm, practiced efficiency they applied to every other scheduled run. The human technicians, several of whom had initially approached the joint ceremony with a certain amount of private, unspoken awkwardness. Nobody had trained them for how to conduct routine engineering work alongside an active alien religious rite, and more than one had quietly worried, in the days leading up to the event, about accidentally causing offense through some small procedural misstep, found themselves, by the end of that first joint run, unexpectedly moved by the experience in ways none of them had anticipated. A young technician named Marcus Delgado, 3 years into his career with the department, and initially assigned to the joint run mostly because nobody senior had wanted the scheduling headache, later described it in an internal department newsletter as the first time in this job I actually stopped in the middle of a checklist and looked at what I was doing. You get so used to routine that you forget the thing you're routine about used to be considered a miracle. Watching the Threll delegation made me remember that, even if just for one shift, it should not by any conventional logic have worked. And yet, somehow standing there watching it unfold, the ancient chanting overlapping with the low mechanical hum of freight release systems, profound cosmic reverence conducted in perfect parallel with municipal efficiency, Denise found herself genuinely, unexpectedly moved. "You know," she told Ambassador Voss afterward, as the Threll delegation began the long process of returning to their ceremonial vessels, "I've coordinated a lot of joint operations in my career. I don't think I've ever seen one quite like that, nor have I," Ambassador Voss admitted. And for the first time in the entire ordeal, something in the ambassador's tone carried genuine warmth rather than diplomatic strain. "I confess, Coordinator Okafor Reyes, I did not expect to find this arrangement meaningful. I anticipated at best a grudging compromise, your people continuing your work with a minimum of accommodation, my people quietly resenting the arrangement while lacking any practical means to stop it. What I witnessed today felt like something considerably more genuine than that. Your engineers approached their task with the same careful precision my clergy brought to theirs. I do not believe your people intended disrespect from the beginning. I believe simply that you did not yet know there was anything to be respectful of. Now that you do, I find myself, somewhat to my own surprise, satisfied. For what it's worth," Denise said, "I think my department's actually going to keep this arrangement going forward, ceremony and all, even once the initial controversy dies down. There's something to be said for pausing, even briefly, to acknowledge that what we're doing isn't actually ordinary, no matter how routine it's become for us. I think we forgot that, somewhere in 11 years of route optimization. Might be good to remember it. All right, real quick before we wrap this one up. If you've made it this far and you're enjoying watching an entire galactic religious crisis get resolved by a sanitation department middle manager with a clipboard, that's basically our whole brand here. Subscribe if you haven't, like the video if this whole scenario is exactly as unhinged and wonderful as we think it is, and let us know down in the comments what other sacred cosmic object humanity's about to accidentally repurpose next. Now let's see how the rest of the galaxy actually reacted. News of the joint Threll-human ceremony spread through the Galactic Union considerably faster, and with considerably more goodwill than the original outrage had. It became, within a matter of months, something of a minor diplomatic case study, cited approvingly by several member species foreign ministries as an example of exactly the kind of flexible, good-faith compromise the Union's founding charter had always claimed to value, but rarely actually achieved in practice. It also, somewhat inevitably, opened the floodgates for a wave of formal requests from other municipal and regional waste authorities across Earth, each eager to establish their own transdimensional disposal programs, now that the initial regulatory and cultural friction had been resolved. Within 18 months, 17 additional Earth governments had established licensed disposal corridors to various supermassive black holes across accessible Union space, each negotiating its own particular accommodations with whichever local civilizations held cultural or religious significance attached to their chosen destination. Tokyo's Metropolitan Waste Authority, working with a cluster of nearby oceanic and shipping-focused member species, developed an entirely different accommodation model built around synchronized tidal observance rituals. Lagos negotiated an arrangement with a technologically inclined civilization that had no religious objection whatsoever but requested, instead, detailed data-sharing rights on the disposal program's engineering specifications, eager to study the trajectory calculations for their own research purposes. Each new corridor became its own small, strange diplomatic negotiation, and each one, following the template Denise and Ambassador Voss had inadvertently established, ended not in confrontation, but in some quietly inventive compromise that left both sides, more often than not, genuinely satisfied. The economic impact was, by any measure, transformative. Landfill expansion across Earth's major population centers effectively halted within 3 years. Waste-related environmental cleanup costs, which had consumed a meaningful percentage of most national budgets for generations, dropped so dramatically that several governments found themselves, for the first time in living memory, debating what to do with the unexpected surplus. Some redirected the savings toward accelerated renewable infrastructure. Others funneled it into public health initiatives that had languished for decades under chronically strained municipal budgets. A handful of smaller nations, freed for the first time from the crushing recurring cost of waste management infrastructure that had once consumed disproportionate shares of their national budgets, found themselves able to invest meaningfully in education and public works for the first time in a generation. A ripple effect that several economists would later argue did more to reduce global inequality in a 5-year span than any single policy initiative of the preceding half-century. Denise Okafor Reyes, promoted twice in the following 2 years, eventually found herself heading an entirely new federal advisory office tasked with coordinating transdimensional disposal policy across every participating American municipality, a job title that would have sounded to her 11 years younger self like an elaborate practical joke. She testified before Congress twice, was invited, somewhat to her own bewilderment, to address a full session of the Galactic Union's General Assembly on the subject of cross-cultural infrastructure negotiation, and found herself, in a development she found endlessly amusing, occasionally recognized on the street by strangers who'd seen her interviewed on the news as the trash lady who talked to the black hole people. "I coordinate logistics," she told one particularly enthusiastic reporter during a follow-up interview, roughly 2 years after the initial controversy. "That's genuinely all this ever was, from my end. I had a problem. I found the most efficient solution. And when that solution turned out to matter more to somebody else than I expected, I sat down and actually listened to them instead of assuming my spreadsheet was the only thing that mattered. I don't think that's a particularly heroic story. I think it's just what the job's supposed to look like, whether you're moving garbage trucks through Queens or negotiating with an alien civilization about the most sacred site in their entire cosmology. Same skill, really, just a much, much bigger scale. Much bigger." The reporter, visibly hoping for something a little more dramatic, pressed further. "But surely," she said, "there must have been a moment where you felt the weight of it, some sense that you were part of something genuinely historic, not just another logistics problem." Denise considered the question seriously, the way she considered most things. "The ceremony," she said finally. "That first joint run, watching the Threll delegation chant alongside my own technicians running their checklist, that's the moment it stopped being just a spreadsheet to me. I don't think I fully understood until I stood there and watched it happen, that the two things, the sacred and the practical, were never actually in competition to begin with. We'd just never given anyone the chance to show us that they could exist side by side. That's the part of this whole story I hope people actually remember, once the jokes about garbage trucks and black holes eventually fade. Not the outrage, not even the compromise exactly. Just the fact that two completely different ways of understanding something enormous turned out to be able to stand in the same room together, if everyone involved was willing to actually listen. But the more lasting impact, several Union historians would later argue, in papers written decades after the initial controversy had faded into a minor historical footnote, was not economic at all. It was the quiet, gradual shift the incident produced in how the wider Galactic Union understood humanity itself. Prior to the Great Annihilator disposal controversy, wrote Dr. Kethis Wren, in a widely cited retrospective published nearly a decade later. This union's understanding of humanity rested largely on a series of prior incidents, demonstrating their capacity for rapid, sometimes reckless technological improvisation, a species capable of remarkable achievement, but one whose judgment remained, in the eyes of many older member civilizations, fundamentally untested. What the Annihilator incident ultimately revealed was something considerably more nuanced, a species capable of causing genuine, profound cultural distress through simple bureaucratic indifference, and yet equally capable, once that distress was made clear to them, of resolving it not through force, nor through stubborn defense of their own convenience, but through the same practical, unglamorous problem-solving instinct that caused the disruption in the first place. Humanity did not apologize by abandoning their program. They apologized by improving it, incorporating the very cultural concerns they had overlooked into the ongoing operation itself, and in doing so, produced an outcome that served both their own practical needs and the deeper values of the civilization they had inadvertently offended. It is, I would argue, the single clearest demonstration this union has yet seen of humanity's actual character. Not reckless, not indifferent, but simply, consistently, more comfortable solving problems through action than through ceremony. A trait that will, I suspect, continue to produce both this species' greatest triumphs and its most spectacular diplomatic incidents for a very long time to come. Denise Okafor-Reyes, still even years into her new federal role, made a point of attending the New York Disposal Run's monthly ceremony whenever her schedule allowed. Not because anyone required it of her anymore, but because she'd found, somewhere in that first strange moving ceremony alongside Ambassador Voss's delegation, something she hadn't expected an 11-year career in municipal logistics to ever give her. A genuine, quiet sense of occasion, a reminder that even the most routine, unglamorous work could, if you let it, carry a little bit of wonder alongside the spreadsheets. Ambassador Voss, for her part, had gone from the Threll's most vocal critic of the human disposal program to, somewhat improbably, one of its most consistent institutional defenders within the wider Galactic Union. Not because her people's reverence for the great Annihilator had lessened in any way, but because she had come over several years of continued collaboration to genuinely believe that the joint ceremonial arrangement represented something valuable in its own right. Proof that ancient tradition and practical modern necessity did not have to exist in permanent, irreconcilable opposition, provided both sides were willing to sit down, listen honestly, and do the unglamorous work of finding a compromise neither had initially imagined. She had, in the years since, become something of an informal mentor to younger Threll clergy entering interspecies diplomatic roles, using the Annihilator disposal arrangement as her primary teaching example of what she called, in her own lectures, sacred pragmatism. The discovery that reverence and utility need not be enemies, provided you have the patience to let them meet each other part way. You know, Denise told a visiting delegation of new hires from the Federal Disposal Office, several years after the program's chaotic beginning, watching a fresh shipment prepare for release alongside a small, now familiar contingent of Threll observers. When I first wrote that proposal, I was just trying to solve a budget problem. I didn't think about what it might mean to anybody else. I've learned, since then, that just because something's routine to you doesn't mean it's ordinary to everyone. Worth remembering in this line of work. Worth remembering in pretty much any line of work, honestly. One of the new hires, young and visibly a little overwhelmed by the sheer scale of what she was watching, glanced at the schedule board mounted on the control room wall. An ordinary, unremarkable municipal schedule, listing routine collection times across a dozen boroughs and districts with one line near the bottom that still read in the same plain administrative font as everything else. Trans-dimensional disposal, Great Annihilator Corridor, scheduled, recurring monthly. Doesn't it ever feel strange? The new hire asked, putting something like that on the same schedule as regular trash day. Denise considered the question for a moment, watching the ceremonial chanting rise gently over the low mechanical hum of freight release systems. ancient reverence and municipal efficiency running, as they had for years now, in perfect, practiced parallel. Every day, she said. Every single day. And I wouldn't have it any other way. You want the honest truth? I think that's the whole trick of this job, of pretty much any job that touches something bigger than yourself. You don't get to stop being amazed just because you've done something 100 times. You just learn to carry the amazement alongside the routine, instead of letting one crowd out the other. Took me a black hole and an 11,000-year-old religion to finally learn that lesson, but I got there eventually. The new hire looked back out at the observation window, at the distant patient chanting, at the slow ceremonial procession of Threll clergy moving in perfect coordination with human freight technicians running their own quiet, practiced checklist, both traditions honoring, in their own entirely different languages, the same simple, enormous fact, that something remarkable was happening, on schedule, exactly as it had for years now, and that neither side had needed to abandon what mattered most to them in order to make room for the other. I think I get it, the new hire said finally. You will, Denise said. Give it a few disposal runs. It sneaks up on you. Outside the control room window, the last of the Threll ceremonial vessels held formation a moment longer than strictly necessary. A small, deliberate pause that had, over the years, become its own quiet tradition, neither required by protocol nor written into any schedule, simply something both sides had come to do without needing to discuss it. One final breath of stillness before the ordinary business of the universe, sacred and mundane in equal measure, resumed exactly on time. Thanks so much for watching this one all the way through. If the idea of an entire alien civilization having a religious crisis over a garbage truck schedule made your week a little better, do us a favor and hit that like button, drop a comment telling us your favorite line from this one, and subscribe so you catch the next story when it drops. Take care, keep looking up, and we'll see you next time.